Novel 5. Andruccio de Perugia comes to Naples to buy horses, meets with 3 serious adventures in one night, comes safe out of them all, and returns home with a ruby. Landolfo's find of stones, began Fiammetta, on whom the narration now fell, has brought to my mind a story in which there are scarce fewer perilous escapes than in Loretta's story, but with this difference, that, instead of a course of perhaps several years, a single night, as you shall hear, sufficed for their occurrence. In Perugia, by what I once gathered, there lived a young man, Andruccio di Pietro by name, a horse-dealer, who, having learnt that horses were to be had cheap at Naples, put 500 florins of gold in his purse, and in company with some other merchants went thither, never having been away from home before. On his arrival at Naples, which was on a Sunday evening, about vespers, he learnt from his host that the fair would be held on the following morning. Thither accordingly he then repaired, and looked at many horses which pleased him much, and cheapening them more, and failing to strike a bargain with anyone, he from time to time, being raw and unwary, drew out his purse of florins in view of all that came and went, to show that he meant business. While he was thus chaffering, and after he had shewn his purse, there chanced to come by a Sicilian girl, fair as fair could be, but ready to pleasure any man for a small consideration. He did not see her, but she saw him and his purse, and forthwith said to herself, "Who would be in better luck than I if all those florins were mine?" And so she passed on. With the girl was an old woman, also a Sicilian, who, when she saw Andruccio, dropped behind the girl and ran towards him, making as if she would tenderly embrace him. The girl, observing this, said nothing, but stopped and waited a little way off for the old woman to rejoin her. Andruccio turned as the old woman came up, recognized her, and greeted her very cordially. But time and place not permitting much converse, she left him, promising to visit him at his inn, and he resumed his chaffering, but bought nothing that morning. Her old woman's intimate acquaintance with Andruccio had no more escaped the girl's notice than the contents of Andruccio's purse. And with the view of devising, if possible, some way to make the money, either in whole or in part, her own, she began cautiously to ask the old woman who and whence he was, what he did there, and how she came to know him. The old woman gave her almost as much and as circumstantial information touching Andruccio and his affairs as he might have done himself, for she had lived a great while with his father, first in Sicily and afterwards at Perugia. She likewise told the girl the name of his inn and the purpose with which he had come to Naples. Thus, fully armed with the names and all else that it was needful for her to know touching Andruccio's kith and kin, the girl founded thereon her hopes of gratifying her cupidity, and forthwith devised a cunning stratagem to effect her purpose. Home she went, and gave the old woman work enough to occupy her all day, that she might not be able to visit Andruccio. Then, summoning to her aid a little girl whom she had well trained for such services, she sent her about vespers to the inn where Andruccio lodged. Arrived there, the little girl asked for Andruccio of Andruccio himself, who chanced to be just outside the gate. On his answering that he was the man, she took him aside and said, "Sir, a lady of this country, so please you, would fain speak with you." Whereto he listened with all his ears, and having a great conceit of his person, made up his mind that the lady was in love with him, as if there were ne'er another handsome fellow in Naples but himself. So forthwith he replied that he would wait on the lady, and asked where and when it would be her pleasure to speak with him. "Sir," replied the little girl, "she expects you in her own house, if you be pleased to come." "Lead on then, I follow thee," said Andruccio promptly, vouchsafing never a word to any in the inn. So the little girl guided him to her mistress's house, which was situated in a quarter, the character of which may be inferred from its name, Evil Hole. Of this, however, he neither knew nor suspected aught, but, supposing that the quarter was perfectly reputable and that he was going to see a sweet lady, strode carelessly behind the little girl into the house of her mistress, whom she summoned by calling out, "Andruccio is here." And Andruccio then saw her advance to the head of the stairs to await his ascent. She was tall, still in the freshness of her youth, very fair of face, and very richly and nobly clad. As Andruccio approached, she descended 3 steps to meet him with open arms and clasped him round the neck, but for a while stood silent as if from excessive tenderness. Then, bursting into a flood of tears, she kissed his brow, and in slightly broken accents said, "O Andruxio, welcome, welcome, my Andruxio." Quite lost in wonder to be the recipient of such caresses, Andruxio could only answer, "Madam, well met." Whereupon she took him by the hand, led him up into her saloon, and thence without another word into her chamber, which exhaled throughout the blended fragrance of roses, orange blossoms, and other perfumes. He observed a handsome curtained bed, dresses in plenty hanging, as is customary in that country, on pegs, and other appointments very fair and sumptuous, which sights, being strange to him, confirmed his belief that he was in the house of no other than a great lady. They sate down side by side on a chest at the foot of the bed, and thus she began to speak. "Andruxio, I cannot doubt that thou dost marvel both at the caresses which I bestow upon thee, and at my tears, seeing that thou knowest me not, and maybe hast never so much as heard my name. Wait but a moment, and thou shalt learn what perhaps will cause thee to marvel still, more to wit, that I am thy sister. And I tell thee that, since of God's especial grace it is granted me to see one, albeit I would fain see all, of my brothers before I die, I shall not meet death, when the hour comes, without consolation. But thou, perchance, hast never heard aught of this, wherefore listen to what I shall say to thee. Pietro, my father and thine, as I suppose thou mayst have heard, dwelt a long while at Palermo, where his good heart and gracious bearing caused him to be, as he still is, much beloved by all that knew him. But by none was he loved so much as by a gentlewoman, afterwards my mother, then a widow who, casting aside all respect for her father and brothers, I and her honor, grew so intimate with him that a child was born, which child am I thy sister, whom thou seest before thee. Shortly after my birth it so befell that Pietro must needs leave Palermo and return to Perugia, and I, his little daughter, was left behind with my mother at Palermo. Nor, so far as I have been able to learn, did he ever again bestow a thought upon either of us. Wherefore, to say nothing of the love which he should have borne me, his daughter by no servant or woman of low degree I should, were he not my father, gravely censure the ingratitude which he showed towards my mother, who, prompted by a most loyal love, committed her fortune and herself to his keeping, without so much as knowing who he was. But to what end? The wrongs of long ago are much more easily censured than redressed, enough that so it was. He left me a little girl at Palermo, where, when I was grown to be almost as thou seest me, my mother, who was a rich lady, gave me in marriage to an honest gentleman of the Girgenti family, who for love of my mother and myself settled in Palermo, and there, being a staunch Guelph, entered into correspondence with our King Charles. One, which being discovered by King Frederick, two, before the time was ripe for action. We had perforce to flee from Sicily, just when I was expecting to become the greatest lady that ever was in the island. So, taking with us such few things as we could, few, I say, in comparison of the abundance which we possessed, we bade adieu to our estates and palaces, and found a refuge in this country. And such favor with King Charles that, in partial compensation for the losses which we had sustained on his account, he has granted us estates and houses and an ample pension, which he regularly pays to my husband and thy brother-in-law, as thou mayst yet see. In this manner I live here, but that I am blessed with the sight of thee, I ascribe entirely to the mercy of God, and no thanks to thee, my sweet brother." So saying, she embraced him again, and melting anew into tears, kissed his brow. This story, so congruous, so consistent in every detail, came trippingly and without the least hesitancy from her tongue. Andruxio remembered that his father had indeed lived at Palermo. He knew by his own experience the ways of young folk, how prone they are to love. He saw her melt into tears, he felt her embraces and sisterly kisses, and he took all she said for gospel. So when she had done, he answered, "Madam, it should not surprise you that I marvel, seeing that in sooth my father, for whatever cause, said never a word of you and your mother, or, if he did so, it came not to my knowledge, so that I knew no more of you than if you had not been. Wherefore, the lonelier I am here, and the less hope I had of such good luck, the better pleased I am to have found here my sister. And indeed, I know not any man, however exalted his station, who ought not to be well pleased to have such a sister. Much more, then, I, who am but a petty merchant, but I pray you resolve me of one thing, how came you to know that I was here?" Then answered she, "'Twas told me this morning by a poor woman who is much about the house, because, as she tells me, she was long in the service of our father both at Palermo and at Perugia, but that it seemed more fitting that thou shouldst come to see me at home than that I should visit thee at an inn, I had long ago sought thee out. She then began to inquire particularly after all his kinsfolk by name, and Andruxio, becoming ever more firmly persuaded of that which it was least for his good to believe, answered all her questions. Their conversation being thus prolonged and the heat great, she had Greek wine and sweetmeats brought in and gave Andruxio to drink. And when towards supper time he made as if he would leave, she would in no wise suffer it. But feigning to be very much vexed, she embraced him, saying, Alas! Now 'tis plain how little thou carest for me. To think that thou art with thy sister, whom thou seest for the first time, and in her own house, where thou shouldst have alighted on thine arrival, and thou wouldst fain depart hence to go sup at an inn. Nay, but for certain thou shalt sup with me, and albeit, to my great regret, my husband is not here, thou shalt see that I can do a lady's part in showing thee honor. Andruxio, not knowing what else to say, replied, Sister, I care for you with all a brother's affection, but if I go not, supper will await me all the evening at the inn, and I shall justly be taxed with discourtesy. Then said she, Blessed be God, there is even now in the house one by whom I can send word that they are not to expect thee at the inn, albeit thou wouldst far better discharge the debt of courtesy by sending word to thy friends that they come here to sup. And then, if go thou must, you might all go in a body. Andruxio replied that he would have none of his friends that evening, but since she would have him stay, he would even do her the pleasure. She then made a show of sending word to the inn that they should not expect him at dinner. Much more talk followed, and then they sate down to a supper of many courses splendidly served, which she cunningly protracted until nightfall. Nor, when they were risen from table, and Andruxio was about to take his departure, would she by any means suffer it, saying that Naples was no place to walk about in after dark, least of all for a stranger, and that, as she had sent word to the inn that they were not to expect him at supper, so she had done the like in regard of his bed. Believing what she said, and being, in his false confidence, overjoyed to be with her, he stayed. After supper there was matter enough for talk both various and prolonged. And, when the night was in a measure spent, she gave up her own chamber to Andruxio, leaving him with a small boy to show him aught that he might have need of, while she retired with her women to another chamber. It was a very hot night, so no sooner was Andruxio alone than he stripped himself to his doublet, and drew off his stockings and laid them on the bed's head. And nature demanding a discharge of the surplus weight which he carried within him, he asked the lad where this might be done, and was shewn a door in a corner of the room, and told to go in there. Andruxio, nothing doubting, did so, but by ill luck, set his foot on a plank which was detached from the joist at the further end, whereby down it went, and he with it. By God's grace he took no hurt by the fall, though it was from some height, beyond sousing himself from head to foot in the ordure which filled the whole place, which, that you may the better understand what has been said, and that which is to follow, I will describe to you. A narrow and blind alley, such as we commonly see between two houses, was spanned by planks supported by joists on either side, and on the planks was the stool, of which planks that which fell with Andruxio was one. Now Andruxio, finding himself down there in the alley, fell to calling on the lad, who, as soon as he heard him fall, had run off, and promptly let the lady know what had happened. She hied forthwith to her chamber, and after a hasty search found Andruxio's clothes and the money in them, for he foolishly thought to secure himself against risk by carrying it always on his person, and thus being possessed of the prize for which she had played her ruse, passing herself off as the sister of a man of Perugia, whereas she was really of Palermo, she concerned herself no further with Andruxio except to close with all speed the door by which he had gone out when he fell. As the lad did not answer, Andruxio began to shout more loudly, but all to no purpose, whereby his suspicions were aroused, and he began at last to perceive the trick that had been played upon him. So he climbed over a low wall that divided the alley from the street, and hied him to the door of the house, which he knew very well. There for a long while he stood shouting and battering the door till it shook on its hinges, but all again to no purpose. No doubt of his misadventure now lurking in his mind, he fell to bewailing himself, saying, Alas! In how brief a time have I lost 500 florins and a sister, with much more of the like sort. Then he recommenced battering the door and shouting, to such a tune that not a few of the neighbors were roused, and finding the nuisance intolerable, got up. And one of the lady's servant girls presented herself at the window with a very sleepy air, and said angrily, "Who knocks below there?" "Oh," said Andruxio, "dost not know me?" "I am Andruxio, Madame Fiordalizo's brother." "Good man," she rejoined, "if thou hast had too much to drink, go, sleep it off, and come back tomorrow." "I know not Andruxio, nor aught of the fantastic stuff thou pratest. Prithee be gone, and be so good as to let us sleep in peace." "How?" said Andruxio, "dost not understand what I say?" "For sure thou dost understand. But if Sicilian kinships are of such a sort that folk forget them so soon, at least return me my clothes, which I left within, and right glad shall I be to be off." Half laughing, she rejoined, "Good man, methinks thou dost dream." And so saying, she withdrew and closed the window. Andruxio by this time needed no further evidence of his wrongs. His wrath knew no bounds, and mortification well-nigh converted it into frenzy. He was minded to exact by force what he had failed to obtain by entreaties, and so, arming himself with a large stone, he renewed his attack upon the door with fury, dealing much heavier blows than at first. Wherefore, not a few of the neighbors, whom he had already roused from their beds, set him down as an ill-conditioned rogue, and his story as a mere fiction intended to annoy the good woman. 3, and resenting the din which he now made, came to their windows, just as, when a stranger dog makes his appearance, all the dogs of the quarter will run to bark at him, and called out in chorus, "'Tis a gross affront to come at this time of night to the house of the good woman with this silly story. Prithee, good man, let us sleep in peace. Begone in God's name, and if thou hast a score to settle with her, come tomorrow, but a truce to thy pestering tonight." Emboldened, perhaps, by these words, a man who lurked within the house, the good woman's bully, whom Andruxio had as yet neither seen nor heard, showed himself at the window, and said in a gruff voice and savage, menacing tone, "Who is below there?" Andruxio looked up in the direction of the voice, and saw standing at the window, yawning and rubbing his eyes as if he had just been roused from his bed, or at any rate from deep sleep, a fellow with a black and matted beard, who, as far as Andruxio's means of judging went, bade fair to prove a most redoubtable champion. It was not without fear, therefore, that he replied, "I am a brother of the lady who is within." The bully did not wait for him to finish his sentence, but, addressing him in a much sterner tone than before, called out, "I know not why I come not down and give thee play with my cudgel, whilst thou givest me sign of life, ass, tedious driveler that thou must needs be, and drunken sot, thus to disturb our night's rest." Which said, he withdrew and closed the window. Some of the neighbors, who best knew the bully's quality, gave Andruxio fair words. "For God's sake," said they, "good man, take thyself off, stay not here to be murdered. 'Twere best for thee to go." These counsels, which seemed to be dictated by charity, reinforced the fear which the voice and aspect of the bully had inspired in Andruxio, who, thus despairing of recovering his money and in the deepest of dumps, set his face towards the quarter whence in the daytime he had blindly followed the little girl, and began to make his way back to the inn. But so noisome was the stench which he emitted that he resolved to turn aside and take a bath in the sea. So he bore leftward up a street called Ruga Catalana, and was on his way towards the steep of the city, when by chance he saw 2 men coming towards him, bearing a lantern, and fearing that they might be patrols or other men who might do him a mischief, he stole away and hid himself in a dismantled house to avoid them. The house, however, was presently entered by the 2 men, just as if they had been guided thither, and one of them having disburdened himself of some iron tools which he carried on his shoulder, they both began to examine them, passing meanwhile divers comments upon them. While they were thus occupied, "What," said one, "means this? Such a stench as never before did I smell the like." So saying, he raised the lantern a little, whereby they had a view of hapless Andruxio, and asked in amazement, "Who is there?" Whereupon Andruxio was at first silent, but when they flashed the light close upon him, and asked him what he did there in such a filthy state, he told them all that had befallen him. Casting about to fix the place where it occurred, they said one to another, "Of a surety, 'twas in the house of Scarabone Buttafuoco." Then said one, turning to Andruxio, "Good man, albeit thou hast lost thy money, thou hast cause enough to praise God that thou hadst the luck to fall. For hadst thou not fallen, be sure that, no sooner wert thou asleep, than thou hadst been knocked on the head, and lost not only thy money but thy life. But what boots it now to bewail thee? Thou mightest as soon pluck a star from the firmament as recover a single denier. Nay, tease as much as thy life is worth if he do, but hear that thou breathest a word of the affair. The two men then held a short consultation, at the close of which they said, Lo now, we are sorry for thee, and so we make thee a fair offer. If thou wilt join with us in a little matter which we have in hand, we doubt not but thy share of the gain will greatly exceed what thou hast lost. Andruxio, being now desperate, answered that he was ready to join them. Now Messer Filippo Minutolo, Archbishop of Naples, had that day been buried with a ruby on his finger, worth over 500 florins of gold, besides other ornaments of extreme value. The two men were minded to despoil the archbishop of his fine trappings, and imparted their design to Andruxio, who, cupidity getting the better of caution, approved it, and so they all three set forth. But as they were on their way to the cathedral, Andruxio gave out so rank an odor that one said to the other, Can we not contrive that he somehow wash himself a little, that he stink not so shrewdly? Why, yes, said the other, we are now close to a well, which is never without the pulley and a large bucket. Tease but a step thither, and we will wash him out of hand. Arrived at the well, they found that the rope was still there, but the bucket had been removed. So they determined to attach him to the rope and lower him into the well, there to wash himself, which done, he was to jerk the rope, and they would draw him up. Lowered accordingly he was, but just as, now washen, he jerked the rope, it so happened that a company of patrols, being thirsty because 'twas a hot night and some rogue had led them a pretty dance, came to the well to drink. The two men fled, unobserved, as soon as they caught sight of the newcomers, who, parched with thirst, laid aside their bucklers, arms, and surcoats, and fell to hauling on the rope, that it bore the bucket full of water. When, therefore, they saw Andruxio, as he neared the brink of the well, loose the rope and clutch the brink with his hands, they were stricken with a sudden terror, and without uttering a word let go the rope, and took to flight with all the speed they could make. Whereat Andruxio marveled mightily, and had he not kept a tight grip on the brink of the well, he would certainly have gone back to the bottom and hardly have escaped grievous hurt or death. Still greater was his astonishment, when, fairly landed on terra firma, he found the patrol's arms lying there, which he knew had not been carried by his comrades. He felt a vague dread, he knew not why. He bewailed once more his evil fortune, and without venturing to touch the arms, he left the well and wandered he knew not whither. As he went, however, he fell in with his two comrades, now returning to draw him out of the well, who no sooner saw him than in utter amazement they demanded who had hauled him up. Andruxio answered that he knew not, and then told them in detail how it had come about, and what he had found beside the well. They laughed as they apprehended the circumstances, and told him why they had fled, and who they were that had hauled him up. Then without further parley, for it was now midnight, they hied them to the cathedral. They had no difficulty in entering and finding the tomb, which was a magnificent structure of marble, and with their iron implements they raised the lid, albeit it was very heavy, to a height sufficient to allow a man to enter, and propped it up. This done, a dialogue ensued. Who shall go in? Said one. Not I, said the other. Nor I, rejoined his companion, let Andruxio go in. That will not I, said Andruxio. Whereupon both turned upon him and said, How? Thou wilt not go in. By God, if thou goest not in, we will give thee that over the pate with one of these iron crowbars that thou shalt drop down dead. Terror-stricken, into the tomb Andruxio went, saying to himself as he did so, These men will have me go in, that they may play a trick upon me. When I have handed everything up to them, and am sweating myself to get out of the tomb, they will be off about their business, and I shall be left with nothing for my pains. So he determined to make sure of his own part first, and bethinking him of the precious ring of which he had heard them speak, as soon as he had completed the descent, he drew the ring off the archbishop's finger, and put it on his own. He then handed up one by one the crozier, mitre and gloves, and other of the archbishop's trappings, stripping him to his shirt. Which done, he told his comrades that there was nothing more. They insisted that the ring must be there, and bade him search everywhere. This he feigned to do, ejaculating from time to time that he found it not, and thus he kept them a little while in suspense. But they who were in their way as cunning as he, kept on exhorting him to make a careful search, and, seizing their opportunity, withdrew the prop that supported the lid of the tomb and took to their heels, leaving him there a close prisoner. You will readily conceive how Andruxio behaved when he understood his situation. More than once he applied his head and shoulders to the lid and sought with might and main to heave it up. But all his efforts were fruitless, so that at last, overwhelmed with anguish, he fell in a swoon on the corpse of the archbishop, and whether of the twain were the more lifeless, Andruxio or the archbishop, 'twould have puzzled an observer to determine. When he came to himself, he burst into a torrent of tears, seeing now nothing in store for him but either to perish there of hunger and fetid odors beside the corpse and among the worms, or, should the tomb be earlier opened, to be taken and hanged as a thief. These most lugubrious meditations were interrupted by a sound of persons walking and talking in the church. They were evidently a numerous company, and their purpose, as Andruxio surmised, was the very same with which he and his comrades had come thither, whereby his terror was mightily increased. Presently the folk opened the tomb and propped up the lid, and then fell to disputing as to who should go in. None was willing, and the contention was protracted, but at length one 'twas a priest said, "Of what are ye afeard? Think ye to be eaten by him? Nay, the dead eat not the living. I will go in myself." So saying, he propped his breast upon the edge of the lid, threw his head back, and thrust his legs within, that he might go down feet foremost. On sight whereof Andruxio started to his feet, and seizing hold of one of the priest's legs, made as if he would drag him down, which caused the priest to utter a prodigious yell, and bundle himself out of the tomb with no small celerity. The rest took to flight in a panic, as if 100,000 devils were at their heels. The tomb being thus left open, Andruxio, the ring still on his finger, sprang out. The way by which he had entered the church served him for egress, and roaming at random, he arrived towards daybreak at the coast. Diverging thence, he came by chance upon his inn, where he found that his host and his comrades had been anxious about him all night. When he told them all that had befallen him, they joined with the host in advising him to leave Naples at once. He accordingly did so, and returned to Perugia, having invested in a ring the money with which he had intended to buy horses. 1 Charles II. Of Naples, son of Charles of Anjou. 2 Frederick II. Of Sicily, younger son of Peter III. Of Aragon. 3 I. A. The Bawd. Novel 6. Madame Biratola loses 2 sons, is found with 2 kids on an island, goes thence to Lunigiana, where one of her sons takes service with her master, and lies with his daughter, for which he is put in prison. Sicily rebels against King Charles, the son is recognized by the mother, marries the master's daughter, and, his brother being discovered, is reinstated in great honor. The ladies and the young men alike had many a hearty laugh over Fiammetta's narrative of Andruxio's adventures, which ended, Emilia, at the queen's command, thus began. Grave and grievous are the vicissitudes with which fortune makes us acquainted, and as discourse of such matter serves to awaken our minds, which are so readily lulled to sleep by her flatteries, I deem it worthy of attentive hearing by all, whether they enjoy her favor or endure her frown, in that it ministers counsel to the one sort and consolation to the other. Wherefore, albeit great matters have preceded it, I mean to tell you a story, not less true than touching, of adventures whereof the issue was indeed felicitous, but the antecedent bitterness so long drawn out that scarce can I believe that it was ever sweetened by ensuing happiness. Dearest ladies, you must know that, after the death of the Emperor Frederick II, the crown of Sicily passed to Manfred, whose favor was enjoyed in the highest degree by a gentleman of Naples, Righetto Capes by name, who had to wife Madonna Biratola Caracciolo, a fair and gracious lady, likewise a Neapolitan. Now when Manfred was conquered, and slain by King Charles I, at Benevento, and the whole realm transferred its allegiance to the conqueror, Righetto, who was then governor of Sicily, no sooner received the tidings than he prepared for instant flight, knowing that little reliance was to be placed on the fleeting faith of the Sicilians, and not being minded to become a subject of his master's enemy. But the Sicilians having intelligence of his plans, he and many other friends and servants of King Manfred were surprised, taken prisoners, and delivered over to King Charles, to whom the whole island was soon afterwards surrendered. In this signal reversal of the wonted course of things, Madame Biratola, knowing not what was become of Rigetto, and from the past ever auguring future evil, lest she should suffer foul dishonor, abandoned all that she possessed, and with a son of, perhaps, 8 years, Giusfredi by name, being also pregnant, fled in a boat to Lipari, where she gave birth to another male child, whom she named Outcast. Then with her sons and a hired nurse she took ship for Naples, intending there to rejoin her family. Events, however, fell out otherwise than she expected, for by stress of weather the ship was carried out of her course to the desert island of Ponza, one where they put into a little bay until such time as they might safely continue their voyage. Madame Biratola landed with the rest on the island, and, leaving them all, sought out a lonely and secluded spot, and there abandoned herself to melancholy brooding on the loss of her dear Rigetto. While thus she spent her days in solitary preoccupation with her grief, it chanced that a galley of corsairs swooped down upon the island, and before either the mariners or any other folk were aware of their peril, made an easy capture of them all and sailed away. So that, when Madame Biratola, her wailing for that day ended, returned, as was her wont, to the shore to solace herself with the sight of her sons, she found none there. At first she was lost in wonder. Then with a sudden suspicion of the truth she bent her eyes seaward, and there saw the galley still at no great distance, towing the ship in her wake. Thus apprehending beyond all manner of doubt that she had lost her sons as well as her husband, and that, alone, desolate and destitute, she might not hope that any of her lost ones would ever be restored to her, she fell down on the shore in a swoon with the names of her husband and sons upon her lips. None was there to administer cold water or aught else that might recall her truant powers. Her animal spirits might even wander whithersoever they would at their sweet will. Strength, however, did at last return to her poor exhausted frame, and therewith tears and lamentations, as, plaintively repeating her sons' names, she roamed in quest of them from cavern to cavern. Long time she sought them thus, but when she saw that her labor was in vain, and that night was closing in, hope, she knew not why, began to return, and with it some degree of anxiety on her own account. Wherefore she left the shore, and returned to the cavern, where she had been wont to indulge her plaintive mood. She passed the night in no small fear and indescribable anguish. The new day came, and, as she had not supped, she was fain after tierce to appease her hunger, as best she could, by a breakfast of herbs. This done, she wept and began to ruminate on her future way of life. While thus engaged, she observed a she-goat come by and go into an adjacent cavern, and after a while come forth again and go into the wood. Thus roused from her reverie she got up, went into the cavern from which the she-goat had issued, and there saw 2 kids, which might have been born that very day, and seemed to her the sweetest and the most delicious things in the world. And having, by reason of her recent delivery, milk still within her, she took them up tenderly, and set them to her breast. They, nothing loath, sucked at her teats as if she had been their own dam, and thenceforth made no distinction between her and the dam, which caused the lady to feel that she had found company in the desert. And so, living on herbs and water, weeping as often as she bethought her of her husband and sons and her past life, she disposed herself to live and die there, and became no less familiar with the she-goat than with her young. The gentle lady, thus leading the life of a wild creature, it chanced that after some months' stress of weather brought a piston ship to the very same bay in which she had landed. The ship lay there for several days, having on board a gentleman, Corrado di Malspini by name, of the same family as the Marquis, who with his noble and most devout lady was returning home from a pilgrimage, having visited all the holy places in the realm of Apulia. To beguile the tedium of the sojourn, Corrado with his lady, some servants and his dogs, set forth one day upon a tour through the island. As they neared the place where Madame Biratola dwelt, Corrado's dogs, on view of the 2 kids, which, now of a fair size, were grazing, gave chase. The kids, pursued by the dogs, made straight for Madame Biratola's cavern. She, seeing what was toward, started to her feet, caught up a stick, and drove the dogs back. Corrado and his lady, coming up after the dogs, gazed on Madame Biratola, now tanned and lean and hairy, with wonder, which she more than reciprocated. At her request, Corrado called off the dogs, And then he and his lady besought her again and again to say who she was and what she did there. So she told them all about herself, her rank, her misfortunes, and the savage life which she was minded to lead. Corrado, who had known Enriqueta Capes very well, was moved to tears by compassion, and exhausted all his eloquence to induce her to change her mind, offering to escort her home, or to take her to live with him in honorable estate as his sister, until God should vouchsafe her kindlier fortune. The lady, declining all his offers, Corrado left her with his wife, whom he bade see that food was brought thither, and let Madame Biratola, who was all in rags, have one of her own dresses to wear, and do all that she could to persuade her to go with them. So the gentle lady stayed with Madame Biratola, and after condoling with her at large on her misfortunes, had food and clothing brought to her, and with the greatest difficulty in the world prevailed upon her to eat and dress herself. At last, after much beseeching, she induced her to depart from her oft-declared intention never to go where she might meet any that knew her, and accompany them to Lunigiana, taking with her the 2 kids and the dam, which latter had in the meantime returned, and to the gentle lady's great surprise had greeted Madame Biratola with the utmost affection. So with the return of fair weather Madame Biratola, taking with her the dam and the 2 kids, embarked with Corrado and his lady on their ship, being called by them for her true name was not to be known of all Cavriuola. 2, and the wind holding fair, they speedily reached the mouth of the Magra. 3, and landing hied them to Corrado's castle, where Madame Biratola abode with Corrado's lady in the quality of her maid, serving her well and faithfully, wearing widow's weeds, and feeding and tending her kids with assiduous and loving care. The corsairs, who, not espying Madame Biratola, had left her at Ponza when they took the ship on which she had come thither, had made a course to Genoa, taking with them all the other folk. On their arrival, the owners of the galley shared the booty. And so it happened that as part thereof Madame Biratola's nurse and her 2 boys fell to the lot of one Messer Guasparino Doria, who sent all 3 to his house, being minded to keep them there as domestic slaves. The nurse, beside herself with grief at the loss of her mistress, and the woeful plight in which she found herself and her 2 charges, shed many a bitter tear. But seeing that they were unavailing, and that she and the boys were slaves together, she, having, for all her low estate, her share of wit and good sense, made it her first care to comfort them. Then, regardful of the condition to which they were reduced, she bethought her, that, if the lads were recognized, 'twould very likely be injurious to them. So, still hoping that some time or another fortune would change her mood, and they be able, if living, to regain their lost estate, she resolved to let none know who they were, until she saw a fitting occasion. And accordingly, whenever she was questioned thereof by any, she gave them out as her own children. The name of the elder she changed from Giusfredi to Gennaro di Procida. The name of the younger she did not think it worth while to change. She spared no pains to make Giusfredi understand the reason why she had changed his name, and the risk which he might run if he were recognized. This she impressed upon him not once only but many times, and the boy, who was apt to learn, followed the instructions of the wise nurse with perfect exactitude. So the 2 boys, ill-clad and worse-shod, continued with the nurse in Messer Guasparino's house for 2 years, patiently performing all kinds of menial offices. But Gennaro, being now 16 years old, and of a spirit that consorted ill with servitude, brooked not the baseness of his lot, and dismissed himself from Messer Guasparino's service by getting aboard a galley bound for Alexandria, and travelled far and wide, and fared never the better. In the course of his wanderings, he learned that his father, whom he had supposed to be dead, was still living, but kept in prison under watch and ward by King Charles. He was grown a tall, handsome young man, when, perhaps 3 or 4 years after he had given Messer Guasparino the slip, weary of roaming and all but despairing of his fortune, he came to Lunigiana, and by chance took service with Corrado Melspini, who found him handy, and was well pleased with him. His mother, who was in attendance on Corrado's lady, he seldom saw, and never recognized her, nor she him. So much had time changed both from their former aspect since they last met. While Gennaro was thus in the service of Corrado, it fell out by the death of Niccolo de Grignano that his widow, Spina, Corrado's daughter, returned to her father's house. Very fair she was and lovable, her age not more than 16 years, and so it was that she saw Ginato with favor and he her, and both fell ardently in love with one another. Their passion was early gratified, but several months elapsed before any detected its existence. Wherefore, growing overbold, they began to dispense with the precautions which such an affair demanded. So one day, as they walked with others through a wood, where the trees grew fair and close, the girl and Ginato left the rest of the company some distance behind, and, thinking that they were well in advance, found a fair pleasaunce girt in with trees and carpeted with abundance of grass and flowers, and fell to solacing themselves after the manner of lovers. Long time they thus dallied, though such was their delight that all too brief it seemed to them. And so it befell that they were surprised first by the girl's mother and then by Corrado. Pained beyond measure by what he had seen, Corrado, without assigning any cause, had them both arrested by 3 of his servants and taken in chains to one of his castles, where in a frenzy of passionate wrath he left them, resolved to put them to an ignominious death. The girl's mother was also very angry, and deemed her daughter's fall deserving of the most rigorous chastisement. But, when by one of Corrado's chance words she divined the doom which he destined for the guilty pair, she could not reconcile herself to it, and hasted to intercede with her angry husband, beseeching him to refrain the impetuous wrath which would hurry him in his old age to murder his daughter and imbrue his hands in the blood of his servant, and vent it in some other way, as by close confinement and duress, whereby the culprits should be brought to repent them of their fault in tears. Thus, and with much more to the like effect, the devout lady urged her suit, and at length prevailed upon her husband to abandon his murderous design. Wherefore he commanded that the pair should be confined in separate prisons, and closely guarded, and kept short of food and in sore discomfort, until further order, which was accordingly done. And the life which the captives led, their endless tears, their fasts of inordinate duration, may be readily imagined. Ginato and Spina had languished in this sorry plight for full a year, entirely ignored by Corrado, when in concert with Messer Gian di Procida, King Peter of Aragon raised a rebellion in the island of Sicily, and wrested it from King Charles, whereat Corrado, being a Ghibelline, was overjoyed. Hearing the tidings from one of his warders, Ginato heaved a great sigh and said, "Alas, 14 years have I been a wanderer upon the face of the earth, looking for no other than this very event, and now that my hopes of happiness may be forever frustrate, it has come to pass only to find me in prison, whence I may never think to issue alive." "How?" said the warder. "What signify to thee these doings of these mighty monarchs? What part hadst thou in Sicily?" Ginato answered, "'Tis as if my heart were breaking when I bethink me of my father and what part he had in Sicily. I was but a little lad when I fled the island, but yet I remember him as its governor in the time of King Manfred." "And who then was thy father?" demanded the warder. "His name," rejoined Ginato, "I need no longer scruple to disclose, seeing that I find myself in the very strait which hope to avoid by concealing it. He was and still is, if he live, a Righetto Capes, and my name is not Ginato but Giusfredi, and I doubt not but, were I once free and back in Sicily, I might yet hold a very honorable position in the island." The worthy man asked no more questions, but as soon as he found opportunity, told what he had learned to Corrado, who, albeit he made light of it in the warder's presence, repaired to Madame Burratola, and asked her in a pleasant manner, whether she had had by Righetto a son named Giusfredi. The lady answered, in tears, that, if the elder of her 2 sons were living, such would be his name, and his age 22 years. This inclined Corrado to think that Ginato and Giusfredi were indeed one and the same, and it occurred to him that, if so it were, he might at once show himself most merciful and blot out his daughter's shame and his own by giving her to him in marriage. Wherefore he sent for Ginato privily, and questioned him in detail touching his past life. And finding by indubitable evidence that he was indeed Giusfredi, son of a Righetto Capes, he said to him, "Ginato, thou knowest the wrong which thou hast done me in the person of my daughter. What and how great it is, seeing that I used thee well and kindly, and thou shouldst therefore, like a good servant, have shewn thyself jealous of my honor, and zealous in my interest. And many there are who, hadst thou treated them as thou hast treated me, would have caused thee to die an ignominious death, which my clemency would not brook. But now, as it is even so as thou sayst, and thou art of gentle blood by both thy parents, I am minded to put an end to thy sufferings as soon as thou wilt, releasing thee from the captivity in which thou languishest, and setting thee in a happy place, and reinstating at once thy honor and my own. Thy intimacy with Spina, albeit shameful to both, was yet prompted by love. Spina, as thou knowest, is a widow, and her dower is ample and secure. What her breeding is, and her father's and her mother's, thou knowest. Of thy present condition I say naught. Wherefore, when thou wilt, I am consenting, that, having been with dishonor thy friend, she become with honor thy wife, and that, so long as it seem good to thee, thou tarry here with her and me as my son. Captivity had wasted Ginato's flesh, but had in no degree impaired the generosity of spirit which he derived from his ancestry, or the whole-hearted love which he bore his lady. So, albeit he ardently desired that which Corrado offered, and knew that he was in Corrado's power, yet, even as his magnanimity prompted, so, unswervingly, he made answer. Corrado, neither ambition nor cupidity nor aught else did ever beguile me to any treacherous machination against either thy person or thy property. Thy daughter I loved, and love and shall ever love, because I deem her worthy of my love. And, if I dealt with her after a fashion which to the mechanic mind seems hardly honorable, I did but commit that fault which is ever congenial to youth, which can never be eradicated so long as youth continues, and which, if the aged would but remember that they were once young, and would measure the delinquencies of others by their own and their own by those of others, would not be deemed so grave as thou and many others depict it, and what I did as a friend, not as an enemy. That which thou offerest I have ever desired, and should long ago have sought, had I supposed that thou wouldst grant it, and 'twill be the more grateful to me in proportion to the depth of my despair. But if thy intent be not such, as thy words import, feed me not with vain hopes, but send me back to prison there to suffer whatever thou mayst be pleased to inflict. Nor doubt that even as I love Spina, so for love of her shall I ever love thee, though thou do thy worst, and still hold thee in reverent regard. Corrado marveled to hear him thus speak, and being assured of his magnanimity and the fervor of his love, held him the more dear. Wherefore he rose, embraced, and kissed him, and without further delay bade privily bring thither Spina, who left her prison wasted and wan and weak, and so changed that she seemed almost another woman than of yore, even as Ginato was scarce his former self. Then and there, in Corrado's presence, they plighted their troth according to our custom of espousals. And some days afterwards Corrado, having in the meantime provided all things meet for their convenience and solace, yet so as that none should surmise what had happened, deemed it now time to gladden their mothers with the news. So he sent for his lady and Cavriuola, and thus, addressing Cavriuola, he spoke. What would you say, madam, were I to restore you your elder son as the husband of one of my daughters? Cavriuola answered, I should say that, were it possible for you to strengthen the bond which attaches me to you, then assuredly you had so done, in that you restored to me that which I cherish more tenderly than myself, and in such a guise as in some measure to renew within me the hope which I had lost. More I could not say. And so, weeping, she was silent. Then, turning to his lady, Corrado said, And thou, madam, what wouldst thou think if I were to present thee with such a son-in-law? A son-in-law, she answered, that was not of gentle blood, but a mere churl, so he pleased you, would well content me. So, returned Corrado, I hope within a few days to gladden the hearts of both of you. He waited only until the two young folk had recovered their wonted mien, and were clad in a manner befitting their rank. Then, addressing Giusfredi, he said, Would it not add to thy joy to see thy mother here? I dare not hope, returned Giusfredi, that she has survived calamities and sufferings such as hers, but were it so, great indeed would be my joy, and none the less that by her counsel I might be aided to the recovery, in great measure, of my lost heritage in Sicily. Whereupon Corrado caused both the ladies to come thither, and presented to them the bride. The gladness with which they both greeted her was a wonder to behold, and no less great was their wonder at the benign inspiration that had prompted Corrado to unite her in wedlock with Ginato, whom Corrado's words caused Madame Biratola to survey with some attention. A hidden spring of memory was thus touched. She recognized in the man the lineaments of her boy, and awaiting no further evidence, she ran with open arms and threw herself upon his neck. No word did she utter, for very excess of maternal tenderness and joy. But every avenue of sense closed, she fell as if bereft of life within her son's embrace. Gianotto, who had often seen her in the castle and never recognized her, marveled not a little, but nevertheless it at once flashed upon him that 'twas his mother, and blaming himself for his past inadvertence, he took her in his arms and wept and tenderly kissed her. With gentle solicitude, Corrado's lady and Spina came to her aid, and restored her suspended animation with cold water and other remedies. She then with many tender and endearing words kissed him 1,000 times or more, which tokens of her love he received with a look of reverential acknowledgement. Thrice, nay a fourth time, were these glad and gracious greetings exchanged, and joyful indeed were they that witnessed them, and hearkened while mother and son compared their past adventures. Then Corrado, who had already announced his new alliance to his friends, and received their felicitations, proceeded to give order for the celebration of the event, with all becoming gaiety and splendor. As he did so, Giuseppe said to him, "Corrado, you have long given my mother honorable entertainment, and on me you have conferred many boons, wherefore, that you may fill up the measure of your kindness. 'Tis now my prayer that you be pleased to gladden my mother and my marriage feast and me with the presence of my brother, now in servitude in the house of Messer Guasparino Doria, who, as I have already told you, made prize of both him and me. And that then you send someone to Sicily, who shall make himself thoroughly acquainted with the circumstances and condition of the country, and find out how it has fared with my father Enriquetto, whether he be alive or dead, and if alive, in what circumstances, and being thus fully informed, return to us with the tidings." Corrado assented, and forthwith sent most trusty agents both to Genoa and to Sicily. So in due time, an envoy arrived at Genoa, and made instant suit to Guasparino on Corrado's part for the surrender of Outcast and the nurse, setting forth in detail all that had passed between Corrado and Giuseppe and his mother. Whereat Messer Guasparino was mightily astonished, and said, "Of a surety there is not that, being able, I would not do to pleasure Corrado, and true it is that I have had in my house for these 14 years the boy whom thou dost now demand of me, and his mother, and gladly will I surrender them. But tell Corrado for me to beware of excessive credulity, and to put no faith in the idle tales of Gianotto, or Giuseppe, as thou sayst he calls himself, who is by no means so guileless as he supposes." Then, having provided for the honorable entertainment of the worthy envoy, he sent privily for the nurse, and cautiously sounded her as to the affair. The nurse had heard of the revolt of Sicily, and had learned that Enriquetto was still alive. She therefore banished fear, and told Messer Guasparino the whole story, and explained to him the reasons why she had acted as she had done. Finding that what she said accorded very well with what he had learned from Corrado's envoy, he inclined to credit the story, and most astutely probing the matter in divers ways, and always finding fresh grounds for confidence, he reproached himself for the sorry manner in which he had treated the boy, and by way of amends gave him one of his own daughters, a beautiful girl of 11 years, to wife with a dowry suited to Enriquetto's rank, and celebrated their nuptials with great festivity. He then brought the boy and girl, Corrado's envoy, and the nurse in a well-armed galliot to Larissai, being there met by Corrado, who had a castle not far off, where great preparations had been made for their entertainment. And thither accordingly he went with his whole company. What cheer the mother had of her son, the brothers of one another, and all the three of the faithful nurse, what cheer Messer Guasparino and his daughter had of all, and all of them, and what cheer all had of Corrado and his lady and their sons and their friends, words may not describe. Wherefore, my ladies, I leave it to your imagination. And that their joy might be full, God, who, when he gives most abundantly, added the glad tidings that Enriquetto Capes was alive and prosperous. For, when in the best of spirits the ladies and gentlemen had sat them down to feast, and they were yet at the first course, the envoy from Sicily arrived, and among other matters reported, that, no sooner had the insurrection broken out in the island, than the people hied them in hot haste to the prison where Enriquetto was kept in confinement by King Charles, and dispatching the guards, brought him forth, and knowing him to be a capital enemy to King Charles, made him their captain. And under his command fell upon and massacred the French, whereby he had won the highest place in the favor of King Peter, who had granted him restitution of all his estates and honors, so that he was now both prosperous and mighty. The envoy added that Rigetto had received him with every token of honor, had manifested the utmost delight on hearing of his lady and son, of whom no tidings had reached him since his arrest, and had sent, to bring them home, a brigantine with some gentlemen aboard, whose arrival might hourly be expected. The envoy and the good news which he brought were heartily welcome, and presently Corrado, with some of his friends, encountered the gentlemen who came for Madame Biratola and Giusfredi, and saluting them cordially invited them to his feast, which was not yet half done. Joy unheard of was depicted on the faces of the lady, of Giusfredi, and of all the rest as they greeted them. Nor did they on their part take their places at the table before, as best they might, they had conveyed to Corrado and his lady Rigetto's greetings and grateful acknowledgments of the honor which they had conferred upon his lady and his son, and had placed Rigetto, to the uttermost of his power, entirely at their service. Then, turning to Messer Guasparino, of whose kindness Rigetto surmised nothing, they said that they were very sure that, when he learned the boon which Outcast had received at his hands, he would pay him the like and an even greater tribute of gratitude. This speech ended, they feasted most joyously with the brides and bridegrooms. So passed the day, the first of many which Corrado devoted to honoring his son-in-law and his other intimates, both kinsfolk and friends. The time of festivity ended, Madame Biratola and Giusfredi and the rest felt that they must leave. So, taking Spina with them, they parted, not without many tears, from Corrado and his lady and Guasparino, and went aboard the brigantine, which, wafted by a prosperous wind, soon brought them to Sicily. At Palermo they were met by Rigetto, who received them all, ladies and sons alike, with such cheer as it were vain to attempt to describe. There it is believed that they all lived long and happily, and in amity with God, being not unmindful of the blessings which he had conferred upon them. 1. The largest, now inhabited, of a group of islets in the Gulf of Geta. 2. Ivy. She-goat. 3. Between Liguria and Tuscany. 4. The Sicilian Vespers, Easter, 1282. Novel 7. The Soldan of Babylon sends one of his daughters overseas, designing to marry her to the king of Algarve. By divers adventures, she comes in the space of 4 years into the hands of 9 men in divers places. At last she is restored to her father, whom she quits again in the guise of a virgin, and, as was at first intended, is married to the king of Algarve. Had Emilia's story but lasted a little longer, the young ladies would perhaps have been moved to tears, so great was the sympathy which they felt for Madame Biratola in her various fortunes. But now that it was ended, the queen bade Pamphilo follow suit, and he, than whom none was more obedient, thus began. Hardly, gracious ladies, is it given to us to know that which makes for our good. Insomuch that, as has been observable in a multitude of instances, many, deeming that the acquisition of great riches would ensure them an easy and tranquil existence, have not only besought them of God in prayer, but have sought them with such ardor that they have spared no pains and shrunk from no danger in the quest, and have attained their end only to lose, at the hands of some one covetous of their vast inheritance, a life with which before the days of their prosperity they were well content. Others, whose course, perilous with 1,000 battles, stained with the blood of their brothers and their friends, has raised them from base to regal estate, have found in place of the felicity they expected an infinity of cares and fears, and have proved by experience that a chalice may be poisoned, though it be of gold, and set on the table of a king. Many have most ardently desired beauty and strength and other advantages of person, and have only been taught their error by the death or dolorous life which these very advantages entailed upon them. And so, not to instance each particular human desire, I say, in sum, that there is none of them that men may indulge in full confidence as exempt from the chances and changes of fortune. Wherefore, if we would act rightly, we ought to school ourselves to take and be content with that which he gives us, who alone knows and can afford us that of which we have need. But divers as are the aberrations of desire to which men are prone, so, gracious ladies, there is one to which you are especially liable, in that you are unduly solicitous of beauty, insomuch that, not content with the charms which nature has allotted you, you endeavor to enhance them with wondrous ingenuity of art. Wherefore I am minded to make you acquainted with the coil of misadventures in which her beauty involved a fair Saracen, who in the course of perhaps 4 years was wedded 9 several times. There was of yore a Soldan of Babylon one, by name of Bemindeb, who in his day had cause enough to be well content with his luck. Many children male and female had he, and among them a daughter, Aladil by name, who by common consent of all that saw her was the most beautiful woman then to be found in the world. Now the Soldan, having been signally aided by the king of Algarve too, in inflicting a great defeat upon a host of Arabs that had attacked him, had at his instance and by way of special favor given Aladil to the king to wife. Wherefore, with an honorable escort of gentlemen and ladies most nobly and richly equipped, he placed her aboard a well-armed, well-furnished ship, and, commending her to God, sped her on her journey. The mariners, as soon as the weather was favorable, hoisted sail, and for some days after their departure from Alexandria had a prosperous voyage. But when they had passed Sardinia, and were beginning to think that they were nearing their journey's end, they were caught one day between divers cross winds, each blowing with extreme fury, whereby the ship labored so sorely that not only the lady but the seamen from time to time gave themselves up for lost. But still, most manfully and skillfully they struggled might and main with the tempest, which, ever waxing rather than waning, buffeted them for 2 days with immense unintermittent surges. And being not far from the island of Majorca, as the 3rd night began to close in, wrapped in clouds and mist and thick darkness, so that they saw neither the sky nor aught else, nor by any nautical skill might conjecture where they were, they felt the ship's timbers part. Wherefore, seeing no way to save the ship, each thought only how best to save himself, and a boat being thrown out, the masters first, and then the men, one by one, though the first comers sought with knives in their hands to bar the passage of the rest, all, rather than remain in the leaky ship, crowded into it, and there found the death which they hoped to escape. For the boat, being in such stress of weather, and with such a burden quite unmanageable, went under, and all aboard her perished. Whereas the ship, leaky though she was, and all but full of water, yet, driven by the fury of the tempest, was hurled with prodigious velocity upon the shore of the island of Majorca, and struck it with such force as to embed herself in the sand, perhaps a stone's throw from terra firma, where she remained all night beaten and washed by the sea, but no more to be moved by the utmost violence of the gale. None had remained aboard her but the lady and her women, whom the malice of the elements and their fears had brought to the verge of death. When it was broad day and the storm was somewhat abated, the lady, half dead, raised her head, and in faltering accents began to call first one and then another of her servants. She called in vain, however, for those whom she called were too far off to hear. Great indeed was her wonder and fear to find herself thus without sight of human face or sound of other voice than her own. But struggling to her feet as best she might, she looked about her, and saw the ladies that were of her escort and the other women all prostrate on the deck. So, after calling them one by one, she began at length to touch them, and finding few that showed sign of life, for indeed, between grievous seasickness and fear, they had little life left, she grew more terrified than before. However, being in sore need of counsel, all alone as she was, and without knowledge or means of learning where she was, she at last induced such as had life in them to get upon their feet, with whom, as none knew where the men were gone, and the ship was now full of water and visibly breaking up, she abandoned herself to piteous lamentations. It was already none before they descried anyone on the shore or elsewhere to whom they could make appeal for help. But shortly after none, it so chanced that a gentleman, Pericone de Visalgo by name, being on his return from one of his estates, passed that way with some mounted servants. Catching sight of the ship, he apprehended the circumstances at a glance, and bade one of his servants try to get aboard her, and let him know the result. The servant with some difficulty succeeded in boarding the vessel, and found the gentle lady with her few companions ensconced under shelter of the prow, and shrinking timidly from observation. At the first sight of him they wept, and again implored him to have pity on them. But finding that he did not understand them, nor they him, they sought by gestures to make him apprehend their forlorn condition. With these tidings the servant, after making such survey of the ship as he could, returned to Pericone, who forthwith caused the ladies, and all articles of value which were in the ship and could be removed, to be brought off her, and took them with him to one of his castles, The lady's powers were soon in a measure restored by food and rest, and by the honor which was paid to Aladil, and Aladil alone by all the rest, as well as by the richness of her dress. Pericone perceived that she must be some great lady. Nor, though she was still pale, and her person bore evident marks of the sea's rough usage, did he fail to note that it was cast in a mold of extraordinary beauty. Wherefore his mind was soon made up that, if she lacked a husband, he would take her to wife, and that, if he could not have her to wife, then he would make her his mistress. So this ardent lover, who was a man of powerful frame and haughty mien, devoted himself for several days to the service of the lady with excellent effect, for the lady completely recovered her strength and spirits, so that her beauty far exceeded Pericone's most sanguine conjectures. Great, therefore, beyond measure, was his sorrow that he understood not her speech, nor she his, so that neither could know who the other was. But being inordinately enamored of her beauty, he sought by such mute blandishments as he could devise to declare his love, and bring her of her own accord to gratify his desire. All in vain, however, she repulsed his advances point blank, whereby his passion only grew the stronger. So some days passed, and the lady perceiving Pericone's constancy, and bethinking her that sooner or later she must yield either to force or to love, and gratify his passion, and judging by what she observed of the customs of the people that she was amongst Christians, and in a part where, were she able to speak their language, she would gain little by making herself known, determined with a lofty courage to stand firm and immovable in this extremity of her misfortunes. Wherefore she bade the 3 women, who were all that were left to her, on no account to let any know who they were, unless they were so circumstanced that they might safely count on assistance in effecting their escape. She also exhorted them most earnestly to preserve their chastity, averring that she was firmly resolved that none but her husband should enjoy her. The women heartily assented, and promised that her injunctions should be obeyed to the utmost of their power. Day by day Pericone's passion waxed more ardent, being fomented by the proximity and contrariety of its object. Wherefore, seeing that blandishment availed nothing, he was minded to have recourse to wiles and stratagems, and in the last resort to force. The lady, debarred by her law from the use of wine, found it, perhaps, on that account all the more palatable, which Pericone observing determined to enlist Bacchus in the service of Venus. So, ignoring her coyness, he provided one evening a supper, which was ordered with all possible pomp and beauty, and graced by the presence of the lady. No lack was there of incentives to hilarity, and Pericone directed the servant who waited on Aladil to ply her with divers sorts of blended wines, which command the man faithfully executed. She, suspecting nothing, and seduced by the delicious flavor of the liquor, drank somewhat more freely than was seemly, and forgetting her past woes, became frolicsome, and incited by some women who trod some measures in the Majorcan style, she showed the company how they footed it in Alexandria. This novel demeanor was by no means lost on Pericone, who saw in it a good omen of his speedy success. So, with profuse relays of food and wine, he prolonged the supper far into the night. When the guests were at length gone, he attended the lady alone to her chamber, where, the heat of the wine overpowering the cold counsels of modesty, she made no more account of Pericone's presence than if he had been one of her women, and forthwith undressed and went to bed. Pericone was not slow to follow her, and as soon as the light was out lay down by her side, and taking her in his arms, without the least demur on her part, began to solace himself with her after the manner of lovers, which experience she knew not till then with what horn men but caused her to repent that she had not yielded to his blandishments. Nor did she thereafter wait to be invited to such nights of delight, but many a time declared her readiness, not by words, for she had none to convey her meaning, but by gestures. But this great felicity which she now shared with Pericone was not to last, for not content with making her, instead of the consort of a king, the mistress of a castellan, fortune had now in store for her a harsher experience, though of an amorous character. Pericone had a brother, 25 years of age, fair and fresh as a rose, his name Marato. On sight of Aladil, Marato had been mightily taken with her. He inferred from her bearing that he stood high in her good graces. He believed that nothing stood between him and the gratification of his passion, but the jealous vigilance with which Pericone guarded her. So musing, he hit upon a ruthless expedient, which had effect in action as hasty as heinous. It so chanced that there then lay in the port of the city a ship, commanded by 2 Genoese, bound with a cargo of merchandise for Clarenza in the Mora. Her sails were already hoist, and she tarried only for a favorable breeze. Morato approached the masters and arranged with them to take himself and the lady aboard on the following night. This done, he concerted further action with some of his most trusty friends, who readily lent him their aid to carry his design into execution. So, on the following evening towards nightfall, the conspirators stole unobserved into Pericone's house, which was entirely unguarded, and there hid themselves as prearranged. Then, as the night wore on, Morato showed them where Pericone and the lady slept, and they entered the room and slew Pericone. The lady thus rudely roused wept, but silencing her by menaces of death, they carried her off with the best part of Pericone's treasure, and hied them unobserved to the coast, where Morato parted from his companions, and forthwith took the lady aboard the ship. The wind was now fair and fresh, the mariners spread the canvas, and the vessel sped on her course. This new misadventure, following so hard upon the former, caused the lady no small chagrin. But Morato, with the aid of the good Saint Crescent in hand that God has given us, found means to afford her such consolation that she was already grown so familiar with him as entirely to forget Pericone, when fortune, not content with her former caprices, added a new dispensation of woe. For what with? The beauty of her person, which, as we have often said, was extraordinary, and the exquisite charm of her manners, the 2 young men, who commanded the ship, fell so desperately in love with her that they thought of nothing but how they might best serve and please her, so only that Morato should not discover the reason of their assiduous attentions. And neither being ignorant of the other's love, they held secret counsel together, and resolved to make conquest of the lady on joint account, as if love admitted of being held in partnership like merchandise or money. Which design being thwarted by the jealousy with which Aladil was guarded by Morato, they chose a day and hour, when the ship was speeding amming under canvas, and Morato was on the poop looking out over the sea and quite off his guard. And going stealthily up behind him, they suddenly laid hands on him and threw him into the sea, and were already more than a mile on their course before any perceived that Morato was overboard. Which when the lady learned, and knew that he was irretrievably lost, she relapsed into her former plaintive mood. But the twain were forthwith by her side with soft speeches and profuse promises, which, however ill she understood them, were not altogether inapt to allay a grief, which had in it more of concern for her own hapless self than of sorrow for her lost lover. So, in course of time, the lady beginning visibly to recover heart, they began privily to debate which of them should first take her to bed with him. And neither being willing to give way to the other, and no compromise being discoverable, high words passed between them, and the dispute grew so hot, that they both waxed very wroth, drew their knives, and rushed madly at one another. And before they could be parted by their men, several stabs had been given and received on either side, whereby the one fell dead on the spot, and the other was severely wounded in divers parts of the body. The lady was much disconcerted to find herself thus alone, with none to afford her either succor or counsel, and was mightily afraid lest the wrath of the kinsfolk and friends of the twain should vent itself upon her. From this mortal peril she was, however, delivered by the intercessions of the wounded man and their speedy arrival at Clarenza. As there she tarried at the same inn with her wounded lover, the fame of her great beauty was speedily bruited abroad, and reached the ears of the Prince of the Mora, who was then staying there. The prince was curious to see her, and having so done, pronounced her even more beautiful than rumor had reported her. Nay, he fell in love with her in such a degree that he could think of naught else, and having heard in what guise she had come thither, he deemed that he might have her. While he was casting about how to compass his end, the kinsfolk of the wounded man, being apprised of the fact, forthwith sent her to him to the boundless delight, as well of the lady, who saw therein her deliverance from a great peril, as of the prince. The royal bearing, which enhanced the lady's charms, did not escape the prince, who, being unable to discover her true rank, set her down as at any rate of noble lineage. Wherefore he loved her as much again as before, and showed her no small honor, treating her not as his mistress but as his wife. So the lady, contrasting her present happy estate with her past woes, was comforted, and as her gaiety revived, her beauty waxed in such a degree that all the Mora talked of it and of little else. Insomuch that the prince's friend and kinsman, the young, handsome, and gallant Duke of Athens, was smitten with a desire to see her, and taking occasion to pay the prince a visit, as he was now and again wont to do, came to Clarenza with a goodly company of honorable gentlemen. The prince received him with all distinction and made him heartily welcome, but did not at first show him the lady. By and by, however, their conversation began to turn upon her and her charms, and the duke asked if she were really so marvelous a creature as folk said. The prince replied, "Nay, but even more so, and thereof thou shalt have better assurance than my words, to wit, the witness of thine own eyes." So, without delay, for the duke was now all impatience, they waited on the lady, who was prepared for their visit, and received them very courteously and graciously. They seated her between them, and being debarred from the pleasure of conversing with her, for of their speech she understood little or nothing, they both, and especially the duke, who was scarce able to believe that she was of mortal mold, gazed upon her in mute admiration, whereby the duke, cheating himself with the idea that he was but gratifying his curiosity, drank with his eyes, unawares, deep draughts of the poisoned chalice of love, and to his own lamentable hurt, fell a prey to a most ardent passion. His first thought, when they had left her, and he had time for reflection, was that the prince was the luckiest man in the world to have a creature so fair to solace him. And swayed by his passion, his mind soon inclined to divers other and less honorable meditations, whereof the issue was that, come what might, he would despoil the prince of his felicity, and, if possible, make it his own. This resolution was no sooner taken than, being of a hasty temperament, he cast to the winds all considerations of honor and justice, and studied only how to compass his end by craft. So one day, as the first step towards the accomplishment of his evil purpose, he arranged with the prince's most trusted chamberlain, one Seuriasai, that his horses and all other his personal effects should, with the utmost secrecy, be got ready against a possible sudden departure. And then at nightfall, attended by a single comrade, both carrying arms, he was privily admitted by Seuriasai into the prince's chamber. It was a hot night, and the prince had risen without disturbing the lady, and was standing bare to the skin at an open window fronting the sea, to enjoy a light breeze that blew thence. So, by preconcert with his comrade, the duke stole up to the window, and in a trice ran the prince through the body and caught him up, and threw him out of the window. The palace was close by the sea, but at a considerable altitude above it, and the window, through which the prince's body was thrown, looked over some houses, which, being sapped by the sea, had become ruinous, and were rarely or never visited by a soul. Whereby, as the duke had foreseen, the fall of the prince's body passed, as indeed it could not but pass, unobserved. Thereupon the duke's accomplice whipped out a halter, which he had brought with him for the purpose, and making as if he were but in play, threw it round Seuriasai's neck, drew it so tight that he could not utter a sound, and then, with the duke's aid, strangled him and sent him after his master. All this was accomplished, as the duke knew full well, without awakening any in the palace, not even the lady, whom he now approached with a light, and holding it over the bed gently uncovered her person, as she lay fast asleep, and surveyed her from head to foot to his no small satisfaction. For fair as she had seemed to him dressed, he found her unadorned charms incomparably greater. As he gazed, his passion waxed beyond measure, and, reckless of his recent crime, and of the blood which still stained his hands, he got forthwith into the bed. And she, being too sound asleep to distinguish between him and the prince, suffered him to lie with her. But boundless as was his delight, it brooked no long continuance, so, rising, he called to him some of his comrades, by whom he had the lady secured in such manner that she could utter no sound, and borne out of the palace by the same secret door by which he had gained entrance. He then set her on horseback and in dead silence put his troop in motion, taking the road to Athens. He did not, however, venture to take the lady to Athens, where she would have encountered his duchess, for he was married but lodged her in a very beautiful villa which he had hard by the city overlooking the sea, where, most forlorn of ladies, she lived secluded, but with no lack of meat and respectful service. On the following morning, the prince's courtiers awaited his rising until none, but perceiving no sign of it, opened the doors, which had not been secured, and entered his bedroom. Finding it vacant, they supposed that the prince was gone off privily somewhere to have a few days of unbroken delight with his fair lady, and so they gave themselves no further trouble. But the next day it so chanced that an idiot, roaming about the ruins where lay the corpses of the prince and Suriasai, drew the latter out by the halter and went off dragging it after him. The corpse was soon recognized by not a few, who, at first struck dumb with amazement, soon recovered sense enough to cajole the idiot into retracing his steps and showing them the spot where he had found it. And having thus, to the immeasurable grief of all the citizens, discovered the prince's body, they buried it with all honor. Needless to say that no pains were spared to trace the perpetrators of so heinous a crime, and that the absence and evidently furtive departure of the Duke of Athens caused him to be suspected both of the murder and of the abduction of the lady. So the citizens were instant with one accord that the prince's brother, whom they chose as his successor, should exact the debt of vengeance. And he, having satisfied himself by further investigation that their suspicion was well founded, summoned to his aid his kinsfolk, friends, and divers vassals, and speedily gathered a large, powerful, and well-equipped army, with intent to make war upon the Duke of Athens. The Duke, being informed of his movements, made ready likewise to defend himself with all his power. Nor had he any lack of allies, among whom the Emperor of Constantinople sent his son, Constantine, and his nephew, Manuel, with a great and goodly force. The two young men were honorably received by the Duke, and still more so by the Duchess, who was Constantine's sister. Day by day war grew more imminent, and at last the Duchess took occasion to call Constantine and Manuel into her private chamber, and with many tears told them the whole story at large, explaining the casus belli, dilating on the indignity which she suffered at the hands of the Duke, if, as was believed, he really kept a mistress in secret, and beseeching them in most piteous accents to do the best they could to devise some expedient whereby the Duke's honor might be cleared, and her own peace of mind assured. The young men knew exactly how matters stood, and so, without wearying the Duchess with many questions, they did their best to console her and succeeded in raising her hopes. Before taking their leave, they learned from her where the lady was, whose marvelous beauty they had heard lauded so often, and being eager to see her, they besought the Duke to afford them an opportunity. Forgetful of what a like complaisance had cost the prince, he consented, and next morning brought them to the villa where the lady lived, and with her and a few of his boon companions regaled them with a lordly breakfast, which was served in a most lovely garden. Constantine had no sooner seated himself and surveyed the lady than he was lost in admiration, inly affirming that he had never seen so beautiful a creature, and that for such a prize the Duke, or any other man, might well be pardoned treachery or any other crime. He scanned her again and again, and ever with more and more admiration, whereby it fared with him even as it had fared with the Duke. He went away hotly in love with her, and dismissing all thought of the war, cast about for some method by which, without betraying his passion to any, he might devise some means of wresting the lady from the Duke. As he thus burned and brooded, the prince drew dangerously near the Duke's dominions, wherefore order was given for an advance, and the Duke, with Constantine and the rest, marshaled his forces and led them forth from Athens to bar the prince's passage of the frontier at certain points. Some days thus passed, during which Constantine, whose mind and soul were entirely absorbed by his passion for the lady, bethought him that, as the Duke was no longer in her neighborhood, he might readily compass his end. He therefore feigned to be seriously unwell, and, having by this pretext obtained the Duke's leave, he ceded his command to Manuel and returned to his sister at Athens. He had not been there many days before the Duchess recurred to the dishonor which the Duke did her by keeping the lady, whereupon he said that of that, if she approved, he would certainly relieve her by seeing that the lady was removed from the villa to some distant place. The Duchess, supposing that Constantine was prompted not by jealousy of the Duke, but by jealousy for her honor, gave her hearty consent to his plan, provided he so contrived that the Duke should never know that she had been privy to it, on which point Constantine gave her ample assurance. So, being authorized by the Duchess to act as he might deem best, he secretly equipped a light bark and manned her with some of his men, to whom he confided his plan, bidding them lie to off the garden of the lady's villa. And so, having sent the bark forward, he hied him with other of his men to the villa. He gained ready admission of the servants, and was made heartily welcome by the lady, who, at his desire, attended by some of her servants, walked with him and some of his comrades in the garden. By and by, feigning that he had a message for her from the Duke, he drew her aside towards a gate that led down to the sea, and which one of his confederates had already opened. A concerted signal brought the bark alongside, and to seize the lady and set her aboard the bark was but the work of an instant. Her retinue hung back as they heard Constantine menace with death whoso but stirred or spoke, and suffered him, protesting that what he did was done not to wrong the Duke, but solely to vindicate his sister's honor, to embark with his men. The lady wept, of course, but Constantine was at her side. The rowers gave way, and the bark, speeding like a thing of life over the waves, made Aegina shortly after dawn. There Constantine and the lady landed, she still lamenting her fatal beauty, and took a little rest and pleasure. Then, re-embarking, they continued their voyage, and in the course of a few days reached Chios, which Constantine, fearing paternal censure, and that he might be deprived of his fair booty, deemed a safe place of sojourn. So, after some days of repose, the lady ceased to bewail her harsh destiny, and suffering Constantine to console her as his predecessors had done, began once more to enjoy the good gifts which fortune sent her. Now while they thus dallied, Ospech, king of the Turks, who was perennially at war with the emperor, came by chance to Smyrna. And their learning that Constantine was wantoning in careless ease at Chios with a lady of whom he had made prize, he made a descent by night upon the island with an armed flotilla. Landing his men in dead silence, he made captives of not a few of the Chians whom he surprised in their beds. Others, who took the alarm and rushed to arms, he slew, and having wasted the whole island with fire, he shipped the booty and the prisoners and sailed back to Smyrna. As there he overhauled the booty, he lit upon the fair lady, and knew her for the same that had been taken in bed and fast asleep with Constantine. Whereat, being a young man, he was delighted beyond measure, and made her his wife out of hand with all due form and ceremony. And so for several months he enjoyed her. Now there had been for some time and still was a treaty pending between the emperor and Bassano, king of Cappadocia, whereby Bassano with his forces was to fall on Ospech on one side while the emperor attacked him on the other. Some demands made by Bassano, which the emperor deemed unreasonable, had so far retarded the conclusion of the treaty. But no sooner had the emperor learned the fate of his son than, distraught with grief, he forthwith conceded the king of Cappadocia's demands, and was instant with him to fall at once upon Ospech, while he made ready to attack him on the other side. Getting wind of the emperor's design, Ospech collected his forces, and, lest he should be caught and crushed between the convergent armies of two most mighty potentates, advanced against the king of Cappadocia. The fair lady he left at Smyrna in the care of a faithful dependent and friend, and after a while joined battle with the king of Cappadocia, in which battle he was slain, and his army defeated and dispersed. Wherefore Bassano with his victorious host advanced, carrying everything before him, upon Smyrna, and receiving everywhere the submission due to a conqueror. Meanwhile Ospech's dependent, by name Antiocho, who had charge of the fair lady, was so smitten with her charms that, albeit he was somewhat advanced in years, he broke faith with his friend and lord, and allowed himself to become enamored of her. He had the advantage of knowing her language, which counted for much with one who for some years had been, as it were, compelled to live the life of a deaf-mute, finding none whom she could understand or by whom she might be understood. And goaded by passion, he in the course of a few days established such a degree of intimacy with her that in no long time it passed from friendship into love, so that their lord, far away amid the clash of arms and the tumult of the battle, was forgotten, and marvelous pleasure had they of one another between the sheets. However, news came at last of Ospech's defeat and death, and the victorious and unchecked advance of Bassano, whose advent they were by no means minded to await. Wherefore, taking with them the best part of the treasure that Ospech had left there, they hied them with all possible secrecy to Rhodes. There they had not a long abode, before Antiocho fell ill of a mortal disease. He had then with him a Cypriot merchant, an intimate and very dear friend, to whom, as he felt his end approach, he resolved to leave all that he possessed, including his dear lady. So, when he felt death imminent, he called them to him and said, "'Tis now quite evident to me that my life is fast ebbing away, and sorely do I regret it, for never had I so much pleasure of life as now. Well content indeed I am in one respect, in that, as die I must, I at least die in the arms of the two persons whom I love more than any other in the world, to wit, in thine arms, dearest friend, and those of this lady, whom, since I have known her, I have loved more than myself. But yet 'tis grievous to me to know that I must leave her here in a strange land with none to afford her either protection or counsel. And but that I leave her with thee, who, I doubt not, wilt have for my sake no less care of her than thou wouldst have had of me, 'twould grieve me still more, wherefore with all my heart and soul I pray thee, that, if I die, thou take her with all else that belongs to me into thy charge, and so acquit thyself of thy trust as thou mayst deem conducive to the peace of my soul. And of thee, dearest lady, I entreat one favor, that I be not forgotten of thee, after my death, so that there whither I go it may still be my boast to be beloved here of the most beautiful lady that nature ever formed. Let me but die with these two hopes assured, and without doubt I shall depart in peace." Both the merchant and the lady wept to hear him thus speak, and when he had done, comforted him, and promised faithfully, in the event of his death, to do even as he besought them. He died almost immediately afterwards, and was honorably buried by them. A few days sufficed the merchant to wind up all his affairs in Rhodes, and being minded to return to Cyprus aboard a Catalan boat that was there, he asked the fair lady what she purposed to do if he went back to Cyprus. The lady answered that, if it were agreeable to him, she would gladly accompany him, hoping that, for love of Antiocho, he would treat and regard her as his sister. The merchant replied that it would afford him all the pleasure in the world, and to protect her from insult until their arrival in Cyprus, he gave her out as his wife, and, suiting action to word, slept with her on the boat in an alcove in a little cabin in the poop. Whereby that happened which on neither side was intended when they left Rhodes, to wit, that the darkness and the comfort and the warmth of the bed, forces of no mean efficacy, did so prevail with them that dead Antiocho was forgotten alike as lover and as friend. And by a common impulse they began to wanton together, insomuch that before they were arrived at Baffa, where the Cypriot resided, they were indeed man and wife. At Baffa the lady tarried with the merchant a good while, during which it so befell that a gentleman, Antigono by name, a man of ripe age and riper wisdom, but no great wealth, being one that had had vast and various experience of affairs in the service of the king of Cyprus, but had found fortune adverse to him, came to Baffa on business. And passing one day by the house where the fair lady was then living by herself, for the Cypriot merchant was gone to Armenia with some of his wares, he chanced to catch sight of the lady at one of the windows, and, being struck by her extraordinary beauty, regarded her attentively, and began to have some vague recollection of having seen her before, but could by no means remember where. The fair lady, however, so long the sport of fortune, but now nearing the term of her woes, no sooner saw Antigono than she remembered to have seen him in her father's service, and in no mean capacity, at Alexandria. Wherefore she forthwith sent for him, hoping that by his counsel she might elude her merchant and be reinstated in her true character and dignity of princess. When he presented himself, she asked him with some embarrassment whether he were, as she took him to be, Antigono of Famagosta. He answered in the affirmative, adding, "And of you, madam, I have a sort of recollection, though I cannot say where I have seen you, wherefore so it irk you not, bring, I pray you, yourself to my remembrance." Satisfied that it was Antigono himself, the lady in a flood of tears threw herself upon him to his no small amazement, and embraced his neck. Then, after a little while, she asked him whether he had never seen her in Alexandria. The question awakened Antigono's memory. He at once recognized Aladiel, the Soldan's daughter, whom he had though to have been drowned at sea, and would have paid her due homage. But she would not suffer it, and bade him be seated with her for a while. Being seated, he respectfully asked her how, and when and whence she had come thither, seeing that all Egypt believed for certain that she had been drowned at sea some years before. "And would that so it had been," said the lady, "rather than I should have led the life that I have led, and so doubtless will my father say, if he shall ever come to know of it." And so saying, she burst into such a flood of tears that 'twas a wonder to see. Wherefore Antigono said to her, "Nay, but madam, be not distressed before the occasion arises. I pray you, tell me the story of your adventures, and what has been the tenor of your life. Perchance, 'twill prove to be no such matter, but, God helping us, we may set it all straight." "Antigono," said the fair lady, "when I saw thee, 'twas as if I saw my father, and 'twas the tender love by which I am holden to him that prompted me to make myself known to thee, though I might have kept my secret. And few indeed there are, whom to have met would have afforded me such pleasure as this which I have in meeting and recognizing thee before all others. Wherefore I will now make known to thee as to my father that which in my evil fortune I have ever kept close. If, when thou hast heard my story, thou seest any means whereby I may be reinstated in my former honor, I pray thee use it. If not, disclose to none that thou hast seen me or heard aught of me." Then, weeping between every word, she told him her whole story from the day of the shipwreck at Majorca to that hour. Antigono wept in sympathy, and then said, "Madam, as throughout this train of misfortunes you have happily escaped recognition, I undertake to restore you to your father in such sort that you shall be dearer to him than ever before, and be afterwards married to the king of Algarve." "How?" she asked. Whereupon he explained to her in detail how he meant to proceed, and lest delay should give occasion to another to interfere, he went back at once to Famagosta, and having obtained audience of the king, thus he spoke: "Sire, so please you, you have it in your power at little cost to yourself to do a thing, which will at once redound most signally to your honor and confer a great boon on me, who have grown poor in your service." "How?" asked the king. Then said Antigono, "At Baffa is of late arrived a fair damsel, daughter of the Soldan, long thought to be drowned, who to preserve her chastity has suffered long and severe hardship. She is now reduced to poverty, and is desirous of returning to her father. If you should be pleased to send her back to him under my escort, your honor and my interest would be served in high and equal measure. Nor do I think that such a service would ever be forgotten by the Soldan." With true royal generosity, the king forthwith signified his approval, and had a ladle brought under honorable escort to Famagosta, where, attended by his queen, he received her with every circumstance of festal pomp and courtly magnificence. Schooled by Antigono, she gave the king and queen such a version of her adventures as satisfied their inquiries in every particular. So, after a few days, the king sent her back to the Soldan under escort of Antigono, attended by a goodly company of honorable men and women. And of the cheer which the Soldan made her, and not her only but Antigono and all his company, it boots not to ask. When she was somewhat rested, the Soldan inquired how it was that she was yet alive, and where she had been go long without letting him know how it fared with her. Whereupon the lady, who had got Antigono's lesson by heart, answered thus: "My father, 'twas perhaps the 20th night after my departure from you, when our ship parted her timbers in a terrible storm and went ashore nigh a place called Aguamorta, away there in the west. What was the fate of the men that were aboard our ship I know not, nor knew I ever. I remember only that, when day came, and I returned, as it were, from death to life, the wreck, having been sighted, was boarded by folk from all the countryside, intent on plunder. And I and 2 of my women were taken ashore, where the women were forthwith parted from me by the young men, nor did I ever learn their fate. Now hear my own. Struggling might and main, I was seized by 2 young men, who dragged me, weeping bitterly, by the hair of the head, towards a great forest. But on sight of 4 men who were then passing that way on horseback, they forthwith loosed me and took to flight. Whereupon the 4 men, who struck me as persons of great authority, ran up to me, and much they questioned me, and much I said to them. But neither did they understand me, nor I them. So, after long time conferring together, they set me on one of their horses and brought me to a house, where dwelt a community of ladies, religious according to their law. And what the men may have said I know not. But there I was kindly received and ever honorably entreated by all. And with them I did afterwards most reverentially pay my devotions to St. Crescentin Hollow, who is held in great honor by the women of that country. When I had been some time with them, and had learned something of their language, They asked me who and whence I was. Whereto I, knowing that I was in a convent, and fearing to be cast out as a foe to their law if I told the truth, answered that I was the daughter of a great gentleman of Cyprus, who had intended to marry me to a gentleman of Crete, but that on the voyage we had been driven out of our course and wrecked at Aguamorta. And so I continued, as occasion required, observing their usages with much assiduity, lest worse should befall me. But being one day asked by their superior, whom they call abbess, whether I was minded to go back to Cyprus, I answered that there was not that I desired so much. However, so solicitous for my honor was the abbess, that there was none going to Cyprus to whom she would entrust me, until, 2 months or so ago, there arrived some worthy men from France, of whom one was a kinsman of the abbess, with their wives. They were on their way to visit the sepulchre where he whom they hold to be God was buried after he had suffered death at the hands of the Jews. And the abbess, learning their destination, prayed them to take charge of me and restore me to my father in Cyprus. With what cheer, with what honor, these gentlemen and their wives entertained me, 'twere long to tell. But in brief, we embarked, and in the course of a few days arrived at Baffa, where it was so ordered by the providence of God, who perchance took pity on me, that in the very hour of our disembarkation, I, not knowing a soul and being at a loss how to answer the gentlemen, who would fain have discharged the trust laid upon them by the reverend abbess and restored me to my father, fell in, on the shore, with Antigono, whom I forthwith called, and in our language, that I might be understood neither of the gentlemen nor of their wives, bade him acknowledge me as his daughter. He understood my case at once, made much of me, and to the utmost of his slender power honorably requited the gentleman. He then brought me to the king of Cyprus, who accorded me welcome there, and conduct hither so honorable as words of mine can never describe. If aught remains to tell, you had best learn it from the lips of Antigono, who has often heard my story. Then Antigono, addressing the Soldan, said, Sire, what she has told you accords with what she has often told me, and with what I have learned from the gentlemen and ladies who accompanied her. One thing, however, she has omitted because, I suppose, it hardly becomes her to tell it. To wit, all that the gentlemen and ladies who accompanied her said of the virtuous and gracious and noble life which she led with the devout ladies, and of the tears and wailings of both the ladies and the gentlemen when they parted with her to me. But were I to essay to repeat all that they said to me, the day that now is, and the night that is to follow, were all too short. Suffice it to say so much as this, that, by what I gathered from their words and have been able to see for myself, you may make it your boast, that among all the daughters of all your peers that where the crown none can be matched with yours for virtue and true worth. By all which the Soldan was so overjoyed, that 'twas a wonder to see. Again and again he made supplication to God, that of his grace power might be vouchsafed him adequately to recompense all who had done honor to his daughter, and most especially the king of Cyprus, for the honorable escort under which he had sent her thither. For Antigono he provided a magnificent guerdon, and some days later gave him his conge to return to Cyprus, at the same time, by a special ambassage conveying to the king his grateful acknowledgments of the manner in which he had treated his daughter. Then, being minded that his first intent, to wit, that his daughter should be the bride of the king of Algarve, should not be frustrate, he wrote to the king, telling him all, and adding that, if he were still minded to have her, he might send for her. The king was overjoyed by these tidings, and having sent for her with great pomp, gave her on her arrival a hearty welcome. So she, who had lain with 8 men in all perhaps 10,000 times, was bedded with him as a virgin, and made him believe that a virgin she was, and lived long and happily with him as his queen. Wherefore 'twas said, Mouth, for kisses, was never the worse, like as the moon reneweth her course. 1 Id. According to medieval usage, Egypt. 2 Id. Garbo, the coast of Africa, opposite Andalusia and Granada.